This
CA update,
conference will now be recorded.
which we are holding weekly through the COVID-19 era. We will pause and wait actually a few moments here, maybe for a few other people to join us. But I just wanted to let people know that we will be starting here within the next, I'd say, minute or two. Thank you. So good afternoon. Again, my name is Glenn Shoemate with Construction Employers Association, and we welcome you to today's podcast, What Contractors Should Know About Cybersecurity and Data Protection. We are pleased to have a few subject matter experts with us this afternoon who will be able to provide us with insights into need-to-know information about cybersecurity threats, risk, contractual and legal obligations, how to implement cybersecurity training, reporting requirements, as well as understand available insurance for cybersecurity. CEA is conducting a series of webinars. We also communicate through this time through newsletter, website, emails, and other webinars like this. We have not had any planned live meetings until we can get through this period of social distancing. So we're, again, trying to provide relevant information, content for our industry and for our members. So again, we thank you for joining us today. We're pleased that you have. We would ask that everyone mute their microphones or speakers, except those who will be presenting. We will be recording this session and making a PowerPoint available for those to view. All of that information will be posted on the CISP website under the COVID-19 page. So again, we thank you. And I'd like to, again, acknowledge that Tom Cardone and Bradley Reed from Franz Ward, as well as our good friend Lacey Rex from Oswald will be our presenters today. Both of these firms and companies advise and support CEA members as well as other companies and organizations with both risk insurance as well as risk and legal advice. And so we appreciate their support, their organization support, and their being on the call. If any presenter, or I should say any guest on the webinar has questions, there is a chat function on the screen that you can enter questions, and either I will acknowledge those to the presenters or the presenters themselves will acknowledge them. There have been instances of cybersecurity that has impacted our industry and has impacted CEA members here in the last year or so, I'd say. So we felt that the topic was relevant, and relevant in the context of a lot of remote work that is transpiring today. And so I think we'll hear some tips today about maybe, things we can do to mitigate risk from cyber security standpoint. So I will now turn this over to Tom Cardone, Franz Ward. Thank you, Tom, and you should have the screen to be able to start our presentation.
Thanks, I appreciate it, Glenn. Just to start out there, I just want to make sure everybody can see the screen. So Glenn, can you see the presentation now? Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Once again, welcome. Obviously, things have been thrown into a weird sense of new norm over the past few weeks. And as Glenn said, technology and cybersecurity is one thing that it's front and center now. As more people are working remotely, it is even more important for contractors to pay attention to their cybersecurity programs and make sure that they are able to mitigate risk and account for the cyber threats that are out there that exist. One thing, as Glenn mentioned, my Cardone, I'm here with Brad Reed, also with Franz Ward, and Lacey Rex from Oswald Companies is joining us. We appreciate everybody being here today. Oftentimes, the cybersecurity is kind of placed on the back burner because a lot of people don't really think that the threat is real. If you Google it, or oftentimes if you're listening to national media, a lot of focus is paid to nation state actors or international cyber criminals. And I'd be interested to see studies on whether what the significance of that threat is to the construction industry itself. There is certainly a threat. The threat is certainly real. The U.S. government has put out some reporting of threats to infrastructure, for example, dams and power plants. There have been instances that have been somewhat public of interruptions and disruption to power grids, for example. But aside from international cyber criminals, the threat still exists, even locally. Phishing, for example, email phishing, as Glenn mentioned, our industry very locally here in Northeast Ohio and in other areas in Ohio have seen phishing attacks where hackers come in and they'll send emails making it look like it's from a contractor or an owner, and significant sums of money have ended up being wired to incorrect accounts and misdirected. As everybody starts to work from home, or more people are working remotely, in the last few weeks, you may have read about Zoom, for example, even having security risks exposed. And if construction companies are using Zoom, for example, it might not be too big of a deal if you're having a virtual happy hour and somebody records everybody having a virtual happy hour and puts it on YouTube. But it's a different story, for example, if you're having a remote project meeting about some critical infrastructure, or, for example, an FBI space that you're working on. So the threat really does exist. And even beyond those examples, a couple years ago, most people might be aware of a Target data breach, where a lot of credit card information was stolen, and social security numbers and whatnot through Target shopping centers. What a lot of people don't realize, though, is that data breach actually came through an HVAC contractor. An HVAC contractor was tasked with updating and maintaining a smart system, and through that system, hackers were able to penetrate into Target's credit card data. And that's really one of the largest risks, right? Is because as we expand the use of what is known as the Internet of Things, there are so many more entry points. It's not only contractors IT systems and their closed system that needs to be protected. There are now subcontractors, and really any person that taps into or that coordinates with your system is a potential entry point. Now, aside from the risk being real, the next question is, okay, well, whose responsibility is it to really protect that data? And the reality is it is your responsibility. As a contractor or a subcontractor, you have numerous legal obligations to protect data. And really it depends upon what type of data that you're trying to protect as to where you look to determine what that obligation is. Before the last few weeks, I would say that, the necessity to protect health information, for example, by construction contractors would be very limited, and there would be very little need for that. But now we have social distancing, and as it happens, some of the technology out there and some of the means that I've read that larger contractors are employing to ensure social distancing or to track social distancing on projects includes wearables that track not only location data, but can also track things like temperature, and give some, even if it's minimal level or information about health condition of workers and employees. And when you start tracking that type of information, now you have obligations under, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act or HIPAA, for example, that you have a duty when you have that information to ensure that it doesn't get out into the public. Aside from that, you may have in a standard form contract or any typical contract you might have on a project, you might have a provision that requires you to perform your services in according to whatever the industry standard is for the location and the service you're providing. As technology and cybersecurity becomes more and more important, that industry standard provision is going to be applied to things like cybersecurity. So if you're not taking at least minimal efforts to protect data, you might actually be in breach of those obligations. One item here, one contract that a lot of contractors or subcontractors may frequently sign or encounter, and you don't really think about this, are non-disclosure or confidentiality agreements. Oftentimes those confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements have provisions that say, you will maintain confidence and secure this information, which may include trade secrets or other intellectual property. You'll take minimum efforts, at least as much as you do, but also, per a minimum standard of care. So, if you're signing a non-disclosure agreement and you're getting confidential information from a third party, oftentimes very sensitive confidential information during the course of a project, and then you're subject to a data breach or some incident, well, now you may have actually breached a contract that you weren't even aware of. And then aside from just typical construction industry agreements or non-disclosure agreements, the federal government has actually implemented a couple regulations. The FARs provide that you have to maintain certain minimum levels of standard. FAR 52204, for example, is a provision that outlines certain minimum requirements of access, awareness, and often see the government implements bleeding.
Tom, so that you're aware, you're cutting in and out, Tom, a little bit. So I'm not sure what transpired.
Oh, let's see. Did that correct it? Did that fix it?
It did. It was only the last minute or so. So you sound fine now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Well, I was just mentioning that, the federal government has implemented certain regulations that they provide minimum level of cybersecurity requirements that include both IT level access requirements, training, awareness, vendor requirements and certifications, and anytime the federal government or any government implements any kind of requirement like that, oftentimes that bleeds over into private projects and the private world, and might set the standard of care for future private jobs. In implementing a program, so we know the risk, the threat is real. You have some legal duty to implement some kind of program, but what is that exactly? What should contractors implement as part of a risk assessment and cybersecurity program? And it really depends upon what data you have and where you are. I've spoken to a couple of cybersecurity consultants, and their answer whenever I ask, well, what should contractors be doing? They kind of laugh. It's like, well, it's really a cost-benefit analysis, because you could have a top-tier program that is the highest security program that's available out there, but the cost of that would probably be prohibitive. It wouldn't enable you to actually continue to work, because the value you receive is just not worth the cost. And as Lacey and Brad will talk about in a little bit here, there's other ways for you to protect that information as well, through contractual provisions and insurance as well. But at the very least, you need to conduct a baseline assessment. You need to track your data. Actually sit down, understand what type of information do you have out there. Treating data like any other asset you would have in your company. Actually inventory, what information you have, where it exists, and also what are the ports of entry, so to speak. How can people within your organization access that? Who has access to it? Who should have access to it? And then also vendors and third parties. What subcontractors or prime contractors or other vendors of yours have access to that information. And then once you map your data and understand what exactly you have where, then you can start to prioritize. Oftentimes, and it would be interesting to hear in a little bit here what type of services Oswald provides or in this regard, is oftentimes you have a risk assessment. After you identify what information you have and where, you start to prioritize the top 2, 3, 4 items of risk, right? So, subcontractors, subcontractor access, for example, because on every single project, there's going to be multiple vendors tapping into data. Protecting your plans and specifications and whatnot is probably a significant point of entry and a high priority risk assessment for contractors. And then, once you map your data and you come up with a risk assessment and you start implementing the plan, this is not something that you can just put in a drawer and never look at it again. You have to have periodic program review and revision. In fact, some insurance policies actually require periodic audit of what security measures you implement. And then with respect to implementing a cybersecurity program, it really comes down to, it's somewhat of a 4-part plan, right? Technical controls, meaning it's something that you definitely need to get your IT department involved with. Or if you don't have an IT department, you should probably get some kind of third-party consultant to address the IT issue. Even though it is often viewed as an IT issue, it is certainly not limited to IT. Every cybersecurity consultant that I've ever spoken to about this seriously advises companies to view this at the highest level. This should be something where C-suite, president level, principal level, owners of companies and whatnot should be involved with. They need to understand that this is the same thing as it affects the bottom line just like any other aspect of the job. So once I mentioned previously, mapping your data and understanding what your risk assessment is and what security you have in place, well, then you can start creating policies such as, who has access, but who should have access. If they have access, how is it password protected and secured, policies with respect to not sharing passwords, and how often you have to change passwords, prohibitions on sharing information or their own access, and then also, as Brad will get into here in a little bit, incident response procedures. And then, importantly, training and accountability, right? You can't just implement a policy and then not train your employees and your subcontractors and project owners, everybody at every level of the construction project for that matter, training them on cybersecurity. It should be something that is implemented on every project, and not only within your company, but you need to coordinate on projects with other companies that you come in contact with, be it prime contractors or subcontractors, so that everybody is on the same page, has expectations of what cybersecurity measures need to be taken, and what the access and the accountability will be. And then in addition to that, as Lacey will talk about here in a little bit, risk mitigation, right? It doesn't matter how strong or how solid of a cybersecurity program you have in place, there's always the risk that there's going to be some incident or breach, and then you need to deal with it. And to the extent that you can't deal with it, or if there's some financial loss as a result, you need to make sure that you're adequately protected with insurance. So right now, I'll turn it over to Brad Reed, who is going to talk a little bit about the cyber incident response.
Great, thanks, Tom. Appreciate being here today, and thanks to the CA for this opportunity. So, wanted to talk through my portion of the presentation is on when you have an incident, right? So you've done all of the things that Tom just mentioned in identifying your risks, understanding the data that you're storing and using, sort of what your obligations are and how to maintain it and protect it. And then you have an incident, a security incident related to that data. And in the cybersecurity world and data protection world, we distinguish between a security incident and a data breach. And so those two things are not necessarily coextensive with each other. Additionally, you often hear of breaches, right? And that's sort of I think in the news a lot and makes headlines, right? Somebody has suffered a breach, and for example, as Tom mentioned, the Target incident, right? And they lost millions of credit card numbers. That is a data breach for which they had specific obligations to report and notify individuals who were affected by it. But going on behind the scenes, there are probably many more security incidents that we don't hear about, in which you have some sort of attack, some sort of event in which your data may have been compromised, and you need to take steps to investigate and determine the extent of the incident, the extent of the potential compromise, and then whether any particular information or data was then actually lost or taken by the bad actor. And so and a key part of this is having that incident response done, plan put in place in advance. Because if you are dealing with a security incident for which you have not sort of prepared how you're going to respond, who's going to be involved, who is in charge of the process, and you don't know who to call right away, and have done this sort of prior to actually suffering an incident, you're going to be behind the curve. Because most likely, if you're actually suffering some sort of attack, a ransomware attack, some sort of phishing related scheme, or other direct cybersecurity attack, it is likely that the bad actors will have been in your system for a period of time long before the attack actually takes place. And so when an incident is happening, it often happens very quickly. That requires an immediate response. But that gives rise to the question of, well, how do you know that you are that you've had a security incident? What do you look for? How do you identify it? When do you need to activate that response plan? And really, it comes down often to employee preparation and training and reporting, because employees are really the first line of defense in any security incident. They're going to be the people that alert you and probably know of an incident happening, but they're also your biggest risk factor, right? They're the human element is really the piece of a cybersecurity protection plan that you can't really control for. You build out your firewalls, you put in place your multi-factor authentication and passwords and encryption, but what a bad actor is looking for is not to break down that wall, but to find where the door is left open. And then that is often by an employee who loses a device, clicks on that bad link for some sort of phishing event, but you need to be able to identify those. And so looking for some examples. One that I think is often overlooked, I mean, we talk about cybersecurity, but it is cybersecurity and data protection. There is still plenty of paper, and in the construction industry, I think probably more so than others, there's a lot of paper and physical files that are contain sensitive and secure information that need to be protected. And so, monitoring and looking for physical access, who has come in and out of a facility, who is coming in and out of a space in which data is being stored, physical files are being stored, locks broken, lost keys, cabinets that weren't closed. All of those can be signs that somebody may have there's either been somebody has intentionally removed and or lost physical paperwork or files that you need to then account for. Another common trigger for an incident is mobile devices. I mean, mobile devices are really one of the biggest risk factors in cybersecurity because people lose them. Just by their nature, they are mobile. They are not tied down to a desk. They are not in an office. They can end up anywhere and everywhere. They get left behind in restaurants, in Ubers, in airports. I mean, all over the place. And if you have not put in place strong encryption and passwords on those devices, or other limits for people and policies and procedures to ensure that people are not storing information that they shouldn't be on a mobile device, aren't saving their passwords or leaving devices logged in so somebody can access their accounts, then you're going to have a bigger problem on your hands. You're going to have an incident that's turned into a breach. Right? So let's say a laptop is lost, but that laptop is password protected and encrypted, and that's reported, and you can say, well, yes, it was a device was lost, but we know that the encryption wasn't broken. We know that all the information on there was secure. So while we might have had an incident, we don't have anything reportable. However, a laptop that is simply maybe password protected, but on which somebody is storing confidential information in an unsecured manner, just on the device itself, depending on the type of information that you have and your contractual and legal obligations, losing that device in and of itself is very possibly a reportable breach, because you don't have no ability to control or know what has happened to the information on it. Another sign of a security incident is unusual network activity, and so it's always a good idea to be able to regularly check the data flows that are in your systems. Most internet service providers and other IT managers can help you assess your kind of regular usage. At this particular time, we expect so much data incoming and so much data outgoing. And if you see spikes in that, particularly at times when you don't expect people to be on the system late at night, on weekends, that is a sign that somebody may or may not, that can be a sign that somebody is engaged in some sort of attack, that there is unusual or improper activity. And so these are sort of key things to kind of look for in understanding, okay, I may have had an incident, I might have had data that has been lost. We need to put the incident response plan in place so that we can find out exactly what happened. And I mean, obviously, other times it will be obvious. You will come in, and if you've suffered a ransomware attack, and all of your files are encrypted, and you can't access the system, clearly that is a security incident for which you need to respond, right? An employee comes in and informs you that they have lost a device. That's an incident that you need to respond. But the sooner you can identify it, the better, because the clock starts ticking very quickly under various legal reporting requirements, as well as contracts. There are often 48-hour notice periods for informing your contracting partners that you have suffered in possibly even just a security incident. And so, understanding how quickly you have to find out in order to and assess what has happened to meet those obligations is key. And that involves a coordinated and integrated response. Everybody kind of up front should be brought in to help assess and identify the scope of the incident. Your legal counsel, your IT department, or your outside cybersecurity consultants or providers, insurance, which Lacey will get into, and then potentially, if there is going to be a reportable breach, particularly if you're dealing with employee information or sensitive customer information, and you believe that some clients are going to find out about it, or customers are going to find out, helping manage those public relations communications. I just recently handled a breach or ransomware attack for a client, and their entire communication system was shut down. Their whole system was encrypted, and so they were not even able to respond to emails in the regular course, or communicate with their customers. And so part of the strategy, part of the important part of their response was not just identifying what had happened and working with IT to identify the source, mitigate, cut off access, use backups, data backups to restore their system, but also working with their marketing folks and team to find out ways to communicate with clients and customers who were trying to reach them, and to have a coordinated response to that, and ensuring that employees were all having the same message as to what happened, because it's, at the time, in the first few days, it was unclear the extent and the scope, and so you want to make sure that you're able to manage that process and know that everybody is putting out the same information. And from the legal perspective, one of the challenges is that you can your attorneys can help coordinate this and potentially provide attorney-client privilege, but also help coordinate with law enforcement if there's a ransomware attack, and helping to ensure that notifications are being done properly. So you've identified your security incident, you've got your team in place. What do? You have to figure out what has happened. You have to document the scope of the incident, the time, all of the details around it. Conduct a forensic analysis. The IT partners, your cybersecurity partners, are critical in this area, because you really need to know if that security incident you've had is a reportable breach. And a lot of times that is going to depend on determining whether or not any information or data was actually exfiltrated from your systems. What left? Did they have access? What did they have access to? Was it compromised? Was it taken? And without knowing that, without knowing the flow of information in and out, you're never going to be able to determine what your breach reporting obligations are. And it is generally key to be able to say that data was not taken to the extent that that is true. If you can show that while there was for example, in a ransomware attack, yes, we were hit, our data was encrypted, but there was no evidence or signs that any data was actually taken or compromised or changed. That is a major differentiator in the response that you're going to have to make. There may still be reporting that's required to your on a contractual basis, as Tom was mentioning, the various contractual requirements, especially if there is a government contract involved. Any type of security incident is going to have to be reported up through those contractual obligations, even if no data was lost or stolen. But what it does mean is that oftentimes you do not have to make direct reports to individuals affected, so individual employees, customers, or make reports to law enforcement. Often the requirement for notifying state's attorney generals or other government agencies under data breach laws requires the actual loss of data. And so being able to understand the difference, what exactly happened, whether data was taken or not taken, is going to completely change who you have to inform and how. Having said that, there are, of course, going to be times where you do have obligations to report the breach or to report the incident to state, federal, international regulators. And understanding who you are potentially subject to making reports to is critical and is something that you have to build into your incident preparation and your controls and policies up front to understand the data that you have so that you know who and where you have to report. And importantly, in the data privacy realm, the reporting obligations are not based necessarily on where you operate, where you do business, but are based on where the individual who is affected resides. And so if you're maintaining information on employees or customers and they are residents of other states, you're doing employees that are outside of Ohio or across the country, you're going to have obligations under those various state laws to make breach reports. And they vary widely as to the timing, what has to be in the contents of those reports, and when and how and whether you maybe have to inform the state attorney general. And then separately, there are federal requirements, whether with the federal contracting standards that again are overlapping, but are also have different time requirements, have different obligations of who you have to report to, how. And so identifying those up front is a critical part, because if you are scrambling to figure out, do I need to make a breach report to Ohio and somebody in Pennsylvania, and maybe I have an employee that lives in Kentucky, or this job is under this contract. In the middle of an incident, it is very difficult to make those determinations. And so having that planned out ahead of time is very helpful. But it's something that's going to have to be done regardless, and decisions made quickly, which is why being able to identify where those what data you have and what's been affected is critical. And then recognizing that this all sounds like a lot of work and cost, it is, but the more that you can plan up front, the more that you'll be able to reduce these costs in the event there is a breach. I mean, but you're going to have investigation costs, you're going to have notification and mitigation costs. If you suffer a ransomware attack and you're down, are you down for a few days, or are you down for a week? You know, what is that going to do to interrupt your business? And then if data actually is lost or exfiltrated, you know, what kind of litigation damages might result? You know, if somebody is actually injured by the data that you lost, you know, that could lead to lawsuits and court costs. And while actually in the data privacy world, we've not seen a ton of direct damages for loss, because it can often be hard for individuals to prove that a particular a particular breach caused them harm. The cost of being able to show that and getting there, and investigations and interruption and damage to your reputational costs is high. And so from my perspective, anything that you can do to build out a solid incident response plan and cybersecurity plan on the front end is going to help reduce the damages or costs that you're going to face when you have a security incident. And I think that's the as critical a takeaway of anything, is that everyone is going to face some sort of security incident for which they're going to have to respond. It's a question of when, not if. It's a threat for no matter the size of your operation. The risks are not targeted at just simply Fortune 500 companies or you know, multi-state contractors. It is anywhere that these bad actors can get at. And so the more that you do up front, the less you're going to have to spend on investigation, and the less you're going to have to spend on notification, because you'll know exactly what was lost or what was taken and how you can limit your notification obligations. And I think with that, turn it over to Lacey to talk about the insurance piece.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to speak specifically to the insurance portion, but you know, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the chat function, and happy to answer any questions as they arise. So this number, this is from Coveware. They're a third party that typically negotiates the actual extortion with the bad actors if there's a situation that arises. And I would say on nearly every ransomware situation that Oswald is involved with, Coveware is generally also part of the whole process. So, and this number is really impactful because I was looking at numbers from, I think, either second quarter or third quarter of 2019. And at that time it was 9.4, and I think it jumped to 16.2 as of their Q4 2019 results. So why that number is important, that's the number of days on average that you're typically down as a result of a ransomware incident. You know, generally, once you actually pay the extortion, you're typically maybe only a third of the way through the process. So it can be, it's going to take a while to recover typically. Now, Tom, if you want to advance to the next slide.
So Lacey, one question I guess I have and kind of a comment. So CEA is comprised of a good percentage or number of smaller contractors that, you know, likely do not have an IT department or an IT specialist, right? They may deal with a vendor, they may try to deal with it kind of on their own. And again, just wondering a little bit about, you know, even as I think Bradley or Tom were talking, sample response plans, tips, best practices, and specifically, you know, again, targeted towards those who may not have an IT staff or department. You know, I also wondered separately or secondly, when you look at ransomware, I presume that's primarily targeted towards larger firms or companies, but I mean, there's also obviously risk for smaller companies. Any sense of, I see ransomware amounts and, and even smaller organizations, it says under 2 billion, but if we're talking about, under 2 million, is that a likely target?
It is. At Oswald, we typically get a few cyber claims a week generally. So, and it's really organizations of every size. So we've had HVAC contractors, plumbing contractors that have fallen victim to it. I would say one of the biggest takeaways, if you don't take anything away from this presentation, from what I am specifically talking about, is you're essentially purchasing an outsourced disaster recovery plan with your cyber liability policy. So let's say you don't have a CrowdStrike or a Kivu or one of those other big names, Mandiant, FireEye. If you don't have one of those vendors on retainer to assist you if you have an incident, you're getting that with a cyber policy. You're getting access to these vendors. You're not having to spend $40,000 a year to put them on retainer or something like that. Generally, premiums are extremely competitive. For organizations that fall under $1 million with no claims and pretty good controls, we're seeing premiums starting in the low 1,000 range. So for that money, you're getting $1 million and you're getting access to these world-class vendors to assist you if you have an incident. And Glenn, to your point, if you're outsourcing your IT services, we've actually seen some ransomware strains such as Sodavinky and things like that, where they actually target the managed service provider. And the reason they do that is they know that if they shut down your IT services, they're not only going to be able to extort from your managed service provider for your hosted IT services, but they're also going to be able to extort all of their clients. So that was certainly something that we saw in 2019 happen pretty prevalently. To this slide by the numbers, 85% of claims come from smaller organizations, so under $1 billion. Obviously, that's a pretty big revenue range, but it's just to show that that's nearly where all of our claims come from, or organizations that fall below that amount. So I think it's a little bit of a misconception that only happens to the big guys. We're also seeing a drastic increase in the cost of actual cyber forensics. On average, a cyber forensics company is going to cost about $400 an hour. And usually they're working around the clock to get you back up and running. So those costs really add up quickly. The extortion amounts and ransom amounts themselves are going up pretty drastically as well. We're seeing on average in the 6-figure range, and that's pretty normal these days. Now, Tommy, if you want to advance to the next slide. So to think about cyber liability, you want to think about it in terms of first-party and third-party coverages. So the first-party costs are going to be those that are going to make you whole after an incident. So that's going to be those costs to hire a legal firm to help you navigate that, your current situation from a regulatory standpoint, your notification obligations. It's going to also pay to reimburse you for the extortion, for the cyber forensics, to hire a crisis management firm to help you recreate your data, because we often find that if you are held for extortion, for instance, it's probably one of the biggest claims vectors that we see. If you are held ransom, typically once you begin the decryption process or you try and restore from backups, we find that a lot of times the data is corrupted to such a point that it needs to, you need to recreate it, or there's some restoration that needs to happen. And so those are all things that need to be taken into consideration. There's also a potential business interruption cost. So are you able to service your clients? Do you provide monitoring to clients or do anything like that as far as your normal services? Are you able to continue operations as normal? Or if one of your IT vendors or one of your third parties is down and they adversely affect you, maybe your biggest supplier is down because of a cyber incident and you're not able to get the products that you need to do your job, is that going to cause a partial or complete outage and affect your business income? The third party would be if you had any suits. So if you had any type of third party if you had any kind of liability for employee information or customer information. It could even be, let's say, you sign a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement, and then you agree to keep that, you're supposed to, and you're charged with keeping that information safe while in your care, custody, and control, and you cannot meet those obligations, and you have liability that arises. It could also come from media liability, or your online presence as well. So there's a number of places where this could come. So it's important to consider it. Attorney generals are getting more and more involved with these incidents. So from a regulatory standpoint, fines and penalties could arise. Tom, if you want to advance to the next slide. So one thing, if you do have a cyber policy, it's something where you should be looking at every year. If you don't have a cyber liability policy, you want to make sure that you're looking at some of these key areas. Retroactive dates, they shouldn't be on your policy. It should be full prior acts, because typically there's a delay when you actually are compromised versus when you discover it. So retroactive dates are something you don't want to see on your policies. I'm not a fan of sublimits. I think everything should be full limit, especially if you're contractually obligated to carry these limits. You could be in violation. You want to make sure that all the representations on your application are true and accurate as to the moment you are completing it, not where you want to be in 6 months. I would say if we do ever have any situations where there's any potential uncovered claims, it's when there's misrepresentations on the application. I am a big fan of limiting knowledge of the claim to the control group, so really the executives or the C-suite. You want to make sure you have an extension for your third-party vendors, either from a supply chain, so non-IT vendors, or your critical IT vendors as well. And the shorter the waiting period, the faster your policy will be able to begin reimbursing you for either a business interruption loss as a result of a cyber incident or a system failure, which could be an unplanned or unanticipated outage. It doesn't have to be a malicious attack on your organization, or reputational harm. So if you see customer attrition occur after you have an incident, and you need something to offset your business income loss. And Tom, if you want to go on to the next slide. There's something too, there's an intersection of crime between intersection of cyber and its overlap between crime, directors and officers liability, and property policies as well. So it's really important to think about cyber is theft of data, crime is theft of money. However, we sometimes can't get coverage for crime under a cyber policy with things like cryptojacking. So if they're using your computing resources to siphon utilities or energy to mine cryptocurrency, or social engineering fraud, or reverse social engineering fraud with invoice manipulation fraud. So if they gain access to your network and then they start changing and manipulating your invoices that they're sending out. So those are some coverage extensions that are important to look for. We're seeing cyber liability coverage restrictions under D&O policies. Those are important to look at. And then there's overlap between property policy and cyber liability. Sometimes when your information is encrypted as a result of, say, ransomware, it is corrupted to such a point where you actually need to replace those actual devices. So think printers, all of your computers, servers, things like that. Your cyber policy will actually pay, if you have an endorsement, to make you whole after that. Tom, if you want to advance. So I would say another thing that's huge, and I really emphasize to my clients, is you may be able to offset some of your cybersecurity spend with your cyber liability policy. So you typically have access to a breach coach under most cyber policies. That's just a fancy word for an attorney that focuses on cyber liability response services. Generally, no cost. You can call them. There's no retention that applies unless you report a claim. eRisk Hub, which has sample policies and procedures, incident response plans, all kinds of great resources. And I mentioned it's essentially a disaster recovery plan. Not so typical. There's online training you can send to clients, password manager applications I'm a huge fan of in my normal day-to-day life, incident response plan review, bit site scanning, so you actually can review your third-party vendors as well, IP shutting devices. There are some that are now collaborating with firms like CrowdStrike to have discounts on endpoint detection response. So there's some really great resources. It's just a matter of taking advantage of them. If you want to advance to the next slide. So that's really it for me. I would say one of the biggest takeaways as well, if you're currently using Outlook 365 and you haven't turned on dual factor authentication, I would do so. You want to make sure that you have dual factor authentication turned on anything, even in your personal life. Payroll processing, your 401k disbursement, those are all really critical. And that's it for me.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lacey. Appreciate that. And again, as Lacey said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. But I do want to ask, I guess, the three of you, both Tom, Bradley, and Lacey. You spoke about, disaster plans. And I guess I go back to is there a source for where one might look for, best practices, what types of insurance coverage should be included, how to go about creating a disaster plan? Any comments from any of you as presenters and speakers? And I do want to, again, open up the opportunity for a few people that I want to call out who are on this call: Cindy Friedman from Dependable, Nicole from Long Roofing, and Dan from NPR, to also ask them why or what about this topic and session interested them, and how they think it might apply to their respective companies. So there's on the screen shows you how to enter a chat, but I think we're going to ask Courtney to unmute everyone to allow for a little bit of group interaction here for just a moment or two before we conclude today's webinar. Again, Bradley or Tom or Lacey, any places that you can suggest individuals go for seeking information? Would appreciate that. But Cindy, your mic is now open, and just curious again about, from Dependable Painting point of view, interest you might have had or have in this topic session, and any specific questions.
No, I thought the presentation was great. We've been having our insurance company asking us to get additional cyber insurance, and Huntington Bank is asking us to pay more for cyber crimes through the bank as well. And I really got my answer from this webinar. I appreciate it.
Oh, okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Dan, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm in-house counsel at NRP Group. And the main reason I wanted to sit in on this was because about a year ago, our company went through a ransomware incident, and just trying to make sure that we're kind of covering our basis and doing everything that we should be doing to prevent and prepare for any future incidents.
Okay, very good, very good.
And I thought this
appreciate
was very helpful.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm glad you did. Nicole, your mic is not unmuted yet. We've tried to reach out to you, and I'm sure that Trevor and others would probably encourage you to join today, but if you can't unmute your mic, or if you're unavailable, understand you could also try to chat with us if you have any questions or follow up. But again, in closing, I'd ask maybe Lacey, Bradley, or Tom to again maybe share where one might be able to find information about tips, best practices, sample response plans, and or I guess some of that could be through reaching out to you directly. But if there are any other sources that you want to share with us, that'd be helpful.
So specifically we have some outlines or templates, but it's really something, so if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to share. Generally we suggest coordinating it with counsel, though. I mean, you want it somewhere between a cocktail napkin and a 100-page document. So whatever is the right fit for you. but it really needs to be tailored, and it needs to be a living, breathing document. And it's one of those things where we have fire drills in our everyday life, right? So you want to think about an incident response plan in the same fashion. It's not something that you should put together, put it on the shelf, and not mess with it. It needs to be a living, breathing document, and there should be backups, and potentially you should have hard copies of it and actual paper copies of it, because if your system's locked up, you're not going to be able to access it, most likely.
Okay.
This is
yeah, and
Tom.
I would echo that.
Go ahead, Brad.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Tom.
So what I would say is echo that as well, but on the front end of things, right? So Brad and Lacey talked a little bit about the incident response and the insurance aspect of it, and definitely when you're talking about insurance, you need to speak with your insurance broker to determine what coverage you have, overlap with other policies that are not necessarily cyber specific. But even on the front end, honestly, one place to look to determine what you should be doing is really in your contracts, because it's much of a contract management thing as it is just a general, cyber protection concept, because your obligations at times are going to be dependent upon, what you've agreed to. So, definitely contract management is a necessary item here, a necessary task. And then also I would say in the PowerPoint here, there's a couple, the 2 federal regulations that are cited in there. They do a pretty good job of providing an outline of what the government, at least the federal government, sees as minimum requirements. But once again, I agree with Lacey that it's going to be company specific, because individual company capabilities are going to vary greatly. So, what's right for one company necessarily isn't necessarily feasible for another.
Okay. All right. Well, we thank you for your.
This is Brad. Knowing what your data is, if you don't know what data you have, a sample policy, a sample procedure doesn't really work. I mean, understanding what is in your system and where it resides in your system is going to be the first step, and then you can go to your counsel, then you could go to your insurer and say, this is what we have. What do we need to do to make sure we're adequately insured, and what do we need to do to make sure that we've got the right systems and people in place?
Okay. I
Okay.
do have a question. This
Go
has
ahead.
been painting, especially since I have a lawyer on call here. Huntington Bank has asked us to pay extra to have more security. And it is, not super expensive, but my point of view is that's their responsibility as a bank. They are to protect my money. But they're saying, well, with all the cyber crime, they want me to pay more to have it protected. And they said that if I do not do it, I need to sign a waiver saying that I have declined to get this extra protection. What is your thought on that?
So to clarify, you're saying that your banking relationship with Huntington saying that they're trying to basically sell you a product or sell you some kind of plan to have higher protection of the funds that you maintain with Huntington? Is that what you're saying?
Cybercrime, yes.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know why a bank, that would be something specific you might want to reach out to your counsel and broker about, because I'm not sure what they're really asking. Huntington, I mean, any bank's going to have an obligation to protect whatever you have, on deposit with them. If they're saying that, because of maybe a line of credit or some lending agreement you may have, that they're going to require as a condition of that you either obtain some additional insurance or some additional protection. I mean, they would be presumably well within their right of contract to require that. But I don't know. I'm not really sure why they would be saying you need to sign a waiver unless you don't get something.
So I actually
Brad
already,
or Lacey?
with them. And so I am secure with what I have with them on my everyday needs. But they said with so many ACHs going out and so many people, doing the cyber crime that when we write a check, what they want us to do is not only write the check and send it off, whether it's electronically or through mail, but then we need to let the bank know that we wrote these checks. So it's like a double check, if you will, but it costs money. And I said to them, well, that's your job. You're supposed to be protecting my checks. And they said, because there's so much cybercrime, they're asking us to do a double check. And again, it's, not a lot of money, but it's going to be about $60, $70 per month cost for this. And they said if I chose not to do it, that I needed to sign a waiver. So I certainly can reach out to my counsel and see, but I thought since I had one right here, I'd ask.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting that they're doing that. Because, yeah, go ahead, Brad. That's weird.
Oh, no, this is the, particularly with electronic payments, this is where a lot of fraud activity is directed, because if you have ACH or other electronic payments set up, and somebody gets some sort of account information or redirects routing numbers, those ACH payments just go out and they get hit there. They hit the account, and it's then often moved overseas, and it's very difficult for the banks to recoup that money. And so it can be hard to get it back. I mean, once it actually, and then it becomes a challenge of which bank is going to be responsible. And I think what probably my sense from what I've seen is they're just looking to find the banks are looking to find ways to monetize, in some ways, adding a product that they can say, well, look, we put another layer of protection on, so you're not going to get hit with a bad ACH that hits your account. But it is both their responsibility, but it is also the challenge can be that sometimes what the banks are often going to fight over whose responsibility is it? Was it the bank that sent the bad payment? Was it the bank that received it that should be able to possibly recoup it? And so they're just looking to move that onto the front end. And particularly, I think what's going on is that it's increased so much that the banks are just trying to figure out ways to deal with it. So, if you have your own strong internal controls in place, then, that's probably better, that may be better than paying the bank to do it. But it's sort of a question of, is it an added peace of mind? And does it get you anything that you maybe don't already have insurance protection for?
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for participating. Appreciate it. Next week's webinar, as you see on the screen here, is delayed payments, kind of a lien bond refresher, and ways you can protect yourself to handle delayed payments during the COVID-19 pandemic, how to file lien and bond claims, and based on the amounts of construction. So we'd hope that those who are here today and others will join us for that session. And as always, if you have any other questions, needs of CEA staff or our members, which include Franz Ward and Oswald, to please let us know. You can reach me, Glenn, Glen, at CEA-CISP, or Courtney, Courtney, at CEA-CISP, with any updates or questions. And thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Appreciate it.
Thank you.